The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk. Lieutenant Colonel Zara Phoenix Nakamura pressed her headset closer, the familiar weight of her flight helmet settling against her skull as she listened to the impossible transmission echoing across the secure channel. The voice belonged to SEAL Team 7's commanding officer, his usual granite composure fractured into something approaching panic. "Phoenix, this is Trident Actual. We need immediate air support. Grid coordinates follow." A pause filled with the distant thunder of explosions. "They've got us pinned down in a kill box. We're taking heavy casualties." The briefing room at Kandahar Air Base had fallen silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. 37 pairs of eyes turned toward the small woman standing near the tactical display, her slight frame dwarfed by the hulking presence of male pilots surrounding her. At 5'4" and barely 120 pounds, Zara looked more like a high school student than the most decorated F-35 Lightning II pilot in the Air Force. The silver wings on her flight suit caught the harsh light, but the rows of ribbons beneath them told a different story, one written in smoke trails and precision strikes across 3 theaters of war. Colonel Marcus "Hammer" Rodriguez cleared his throat, his weathered face creased with skepticism. "Phoenix, you sure you can handle this? The SEALs are requesting danger-close support in mountainous terrain. Zero visibility, AAA defenses, and hostile SAM sites painting the entire valley." His tone carried the weight of doubt that had followed Zara throughout her 13-year career, the same dismissive inflection she'd heard from instructors, fellow pilots, and superior officers who couldn't reconcile her appearance with her service record. The tactical display showed a nightmare scenario: 12 elite Navy SEALs trapped in a narrow valley surrounded by entrenched enemy positions. Intelligence reports indicated at least 200 hostiles, armed with Soviet-era surface-to-air missiles and heavy machine gun emplacements carved into the mountainsides. The terrain funneled aircraft into a deadly corridor where maneuverability became a luxury no pilot could afford. 3 previous close air support missions had been turned back by the intensity of ground fire, their pilots unwilling to risk their aircraft and lives for what appeared to be a suicide run. Zara's dark eyes moved across the display, calculating angles and approach vectors with the mechanical precision that had earned her the Phoenix call sign. She'd been shot down twice, ejected once over hostile territory, and walked away from crashes that should have killed her. Each time, she'd risen from the ashes stronger than before, her reputation growing with every impossible mission she completed. The morning air outside carried the scent of aviation fuel and desert sand, mixing with the metallic taste of adrenaline that always preceded combat operations. Somewhere in those mountains, 12 of America's finest warriors were counting down their final moments, their faith placed in the hands of a pilot most of their colleagues had never taken seriously. The irony wasn't lost on Zara. The same military establishment that had questioned her capabilities was now begging for her intervention. Ground Crew Chief Master Sergeant Tommy Wrench Patterson approached her F-35, his grease-stained coveralls and calloused hands representing 23 years of keeping aircraft airworthy. He'd worked with Phoenix for 2 deployments, watching her transform from an uncertain young officer into a lethal instrument of American air power. His initial skepticism had evolved into something approaching reverence, though he'd never admit it to the other chiefs. "She's locked and loaded, ma'am," Wrench reported, patting the aircraft's titanium skin with paternal affection. "Full complement of GBU-54 laser JDAMs, 500 rounds for the gun, and enough fuel to loiter for 3 hours. He paused, studying her face beneath the helmet visor. "Intel says it's a meat grinder up there. You sure about this?" Zara's gloved hand traced the Phoenix emblem painted beneath her canopy, a stylized bird rising from flames, its wings spread in defiant triumph. The artwork had been added after her second shoot-down, when she'd spent 4 days evading capture in Taliban territory before extraction. Her squadron had commissioned the design as a joke initially, mocking what they perceived as her tendency to crash expensive aircraft. Now it served as a symbol of something else entirely, the refusal to stay down regardless of the odds. Wrench, those boys didn't survive Hell Week just to die in some unnamed valley because their air support got cold feet, she replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that unnerved both enemies and allies. Besides, somebody's got to show these mountain fighters what precision looks like. The pre-flight checklist became a ritual of preparation, each switch and gauge verification bringing her closer to the moment when gravity would release its hold. The F-35 systems hummed to life around her, $35 million of cutting-edge technology responding to her touch like a perfectly tuned instrument. Heads-up display information cascaded across her visor, painting the world in tactical overlays of threat assessments and navigation data. Tower Control's voice filled her helmet as she taxied toward the runway. Phoenix 77, you're cleared for takeoff. Weather reports heavy cloud cover over target area with 40-knot crosswinds. Surface visibility less than half a mile due to dust and smoke. The F-35 single Pratt & Whitney engine spooled up to full power, 38,000 pounds of thrust pressing her back into the ejection seat as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. At 160 knots, she pulled back on the stick, feeling the familiar sensation of Earth falling away beneath titanium wings. The base shrunk to toy proportions below as she climbed through scattered clouds toward her operational altitude. Radio chatter filled the tactical frequency as other aircraft in the area acknowledged her departure. Most of the transmissions carried underlying notes of skepticism. Phoenix was known for accepting missions others deemed too dangerous, but this particular scenario pushed beyond reckless into potentially suicidal territory. The mountain valley had already claimed 2 aircraft and nearly a dozen aircrew members over the past 6 months. At 25,000 feet, Zara leveled off and engaged the F-35 stealth systems, her aircraft becoming nearly invisible to enemy radar installations scattered throughout the region. The heads-up display shifted to combat configuration, weapon systems coming online with soft electronic tones that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Below, the Afghan landscape stretched endlessly, brown and unforgiving under the rising sun. The first radio transmission from the trapped SEALs came through encrypted channels, desperation barely contained beneath military professionalism. Any station, this is Trident 7. We have sustained multiple casualties and are running low on ammunition. Enemy forces are massing for final assault on our position. Immediate air support required. Lieutenant Jake Spider Morrison had been with SEAL Team 7 for 8 years, long enough to know when a situation had moved beyond salvageable into the realm of final stands. His team had been inserted 36 hours earlier to eliminate a high-value target, a Taliban commander coordinating attacks against coalition supply routes. The mission had gone sideways within minutes of insertion when their helicopter took ground fire, forcing an emergency, landing 3 clicks from their intended drop zone. Now they were pinned down in a rocky outcropping barely large enough to shelter 12 men, surrounded by at least 2 companies of hardened fighters who knew every cave and crevice in these mountains. Spider's rifle felt inadequate against the volume of fire converging on their position, AK-47 rounds sparking off granite inches from his head as he tried to coordinate their defense. Phoenix 77, this is Trident Actual, came the voice of Commander Brad Poseidon Kelly over the radio. We're in a world of hurt down here. Grid coordinates November Delta 478923. Danger close authorization granted for any available ordnance. Zara's fingers danced across the F-35's touchscreen displays, inputting the coordinates and cross-referencing them with satellite imagery uploaded during her flight. The tactical picture that emerged made her stomach clench. The SEALs had taken refuge in a shallow depression, surrounded by elevated firing positions on 3 sides. Any approach would expose her aircraft to concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple vectors simultaneously. Trident Actual, Phoenix 7-7. I have your position marked. Be advised, I'm seeing significant surface-to-air threat indicators painting the entire valley. Can you provide laser designation for priority targets? The response came back immediately, tension evident despite the professional delivery. Phoenix, negative on laser designation. Our SOFLAM took shrapnel 20 minutes ago. You're going in blind with visual identification only. Flying blind into a heavily defended valley to provide close air support for troops in contact represented the kind of mission flight instructors used as examples of what never to attempt. Every tactical manual warned against it, every simulation ended in disaster, and every experienced pilot understood the mathematics of survival that made such operations nearly impossible. The margin for error measured in inches rather than feet, with no room for mechanical failure, pilot error, or simple bad luck. Zara banked her F-35 into a steep descent, trading altitude for speed as she approached the valley entrance. The mountain peaks rose on either side like the jaws of some prehistoric predator, their snow-capped summits disappearing into cloud cover that would mask her approach until the final seconds. Her heads-up display tracked multiple radar emissions from surface-to-air missile sites, painting threat cones across her intended flight path in aggressive red overlays. The first surface-to-air missile launched when she was still 8 miles out, a contrail of white smoke marking its ascent toward her position. The F-35's defensive systems immediately engaged, deploying chaff and flare countermeasures while calculating evasive maneuvers. Zara threw the aircraft into a rolling dive, G-forces pressing her deep into the ejection seat as she maneuvered around the incoming threat. Phoenix 7-7, Trident Actual. We can hear you coming in. Enemy forces are converging on our position from the north and east. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they overrun us. The valley opened before her like the mouth of hell, muzzle flashes twinkling from dozens of positions carved into the mountainsides. Tracer rounds arced upward in deadly streams of light, creating a web of destruction that no aircraft should attempt to penetrate. The trapped seals were visible as tiny figures pressed against the valley floor, their position marked by the distinctive pattern of their defensive fire. Zara's first attack run took her directly through the center of the kill zone, the F-35's cannon chattering as she strafed the most obvious machine gun emplacements. 20-millimeter rounds chewed through sandbags and concrete, sending up fountains of debris as she pulled up and banked hard left to avoid the worst of the return fire. Her aircraft shuddered under the impact of at least 6 hits, warning lights flickering across the cockpit displays. "Good hits, Phoenix," came Spider's voice over the radio. "You knocked out the heavy gun position on the North Ridge, but they've got more weapons than we thought. At least a dozen heavy machine guns and multiple RPG teams." The second pass required her to fly even lower, skimming the valley floor at nearly 400 knots, while enemy fighters emerged from concealed positions to engage her with everything from assault rifles to rocket-propelled grenades. The F-35's stealth capabilities meant little at such close range. Visual acquisition made electronic countermeasures irrelevant when bullets traveled faster than defensive systems could react. Her targeting system locked onto a cluster of fighters surrounding a mortar position, the GBU-54's laser guidance system painting the target with invisible energy. The 500-pound bomb released cleanly from its internal bay, following a ballistic arc that terminated in a thunderous explosion among the enemy positions. Secondary detonations suggested they'd hit an ammunition cache, the blast wave rolling across the valley floor like the breath of an angry god. "Phoenix, you're taking heavy fire," Commander Kelly's voice carried new respect mixed with concern. "Your aircraft is streaming something, fuel or hydraulic fluid. Consider breaking off and returning to base." Zara checked her instrument panel, noting the steady drop in hydraulic pressure, and the amber warning lights indicating system degradation. The F-35 was built to sustain battle damage and continue flying, but every hit brought her closer to the point where continuing the mission became mathematically impossible. Behind her, the trapped SEALs were still fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Negative, Trident Actual. I'm not leaving you boys to die in this valley. The third attack run took her through the heart of the enemy positions on the eastern ridge, where intelligence had identified the command element coordinating the assault on the SEAL position. Her targeting computer struggled to maintain lock through the dense smoke and dust thrown up by previous strikes, forcing her to rely on visual identification of targets moving among the rocky outcroppings. The 25 cannon rounds walked across the ridgeline like deadly rain, each impact sending up puffs of stone and flesh as the high-explosive rounds found their marks. An RPG team disappeared in a cloud of pink mist, their weapon tumbling end over end down the mountainside. A second later, return fire hammered her aircraft with such intensity that the cockpit filled with the sound of metal striking metal. Master warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel as multiple systems registered damage. Engine temperature climbed toward redline levels, hydraulic pressure dropped to minimum operational levels, and her flight control computer began compensating for control surface damage that threatened to make the aircraft uncontrollable. Any rational pilot would have declared an emergency and headed for the nearest suitable airfield. Instead, Zara rolled into her fourth attack run. Phoenix 7-7, this is Crown Control. The voice belonged to the airborne warning and control system aircraft orbiting safely outside the engagement zone. We're showing significant battle damage to your aircraft. Recommend immediate egress to Kandahar for emergency landing. Crown Control, Phoenix 7-7. I still have ordnance remaining and troops in contact below. Continuing mission. The valley had become a hellscape of smoke, flame, and flying metal. Her previous strikes had eliminated perhaps a quarter of the enemy positions, but the remaining fighters had adjusted their tactics, concentrating their fire on the narrow flight corridors her aircraft was forced to use. Every approach brought her through a gauntlet of automatic weapons fire, RPGs, and at least 2 more surface-to-air missiles that had failed to achieve lock due to the extreme low-altitude flying required. Spider's voice crackled through the static. Phoenix, enemy assault teams are within 50 meters of our position. We need immediate danger close support on the southern approach. Danger close meant dropping ordnance within the lethal radius of friendly forces, a violation of every safety protocol that existed for good reason. Miscalculation by even a few meters would result in friendly fire casualties that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The mathematics of precision required perfect flying, perfect targeting, and perfect timing with no margin for equipment failure or human error. Zara's hands moved across the F-35's controls with surgical precision, configuring the final GBU-54 for minimum arming distance and maximum fragmentation pattern. The targeting system painted the approaching enemy fighters with laser energy, calculating wind speed, aircraft velocity, and ballistic trajectory with computer-assisted accuracy. At the moment of release, she was flying inverted at 200 feet above ground level, enemy tracer rounds passing so close to her canopy that she could see individual muzzle flashes. The bomb's explosion lit the valley floor like a miniature sun, the concussion wave lifting debris 300 feet into the air and silencing every weapon within a 200-meter radius. When the smoke cleared, the enemy assault teams had been reduced to scattered equipment and silence. The immediate threat to the trapped SEALs had been eliminated, though distant movement suggested surviving fighters were regrouping for another attempt. Outstanding, outstanding. Spider's voice carried pure relief and amazement. Phoenix, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Enemy assault teams are neutralized. You just saved 12 lives. But Zara's F-35 was dying around her. Engine temperature had pushed into the red zone, Multiple hydraulic systems had failed completely, and her flight controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive. Fuel was streaming from punctured tanks, leaving a visible trail behind her aircraft as she climbed away from the valley floor. The nearest suitable airfield was 90 miles away, a distance that might as well have been 900 given her aircraft's deteriorating condition. Phoenix 77, Crown Control, we're coordinating search and rescue assets for your position. Can you maintain level flight? The honest answer was no. The F-35 was flying on borrowed time, held aloft more by pilot skill and determination than by any aerodynamic principles. But 90 miles below, 12 Navy SEALs were still trapped in hostile territory, their extraction dependent on continued air support until rescue helicopters could reach their position. Other aircraft in the area had been monitoring her radio transmissions, hearing firsthand the impossible mission she'd undertaken when everyone else had declared it too dangerous. Crown Control, Phoenix 77. I'm staying on station until extraction is complete. The silence that followed her transmission spoke volumes about the reaction of pilots and controllers who understood the mathematics of what she was attempting. Flying a combat-damaged aircraft in a hostile environment was dangerous enough. Remaining on station to provide continued support bordered on the suicidal. Yet her F-35 continued its slow orbit above the valley, weapon systems still active despite the cascade of warning lights illuminating her cockpit. Commander Kelly's voice carried new reverence when he spoke. Phoenix, this is Trident Actual. Extraction birds are inbound, ETA 20 minutes. We can hold position until then, thanks to your intervention. 20 minutes became an eternity as Zara nursed her failing aircraft through the thin mountain air. Engine power continued degrading, forcing her to accept ever lower altitudes to maintain airspeed. Hydraulic fluid stained her canopy where it leaked from damaged lines, and the smell of overheated electronics filled her oxygen mask. Every minute that passed brought her closer to the point where ejection would become her only option for survival. But she held station, her damaged F-35 maintaining a protective orbit above the valley like a guardian angel with broken wings. The sight of her aircraft continuing to fly despite obvious battle damage had a psychological effect on both friendly and enemy forces. The SEALs drew courage from her presence, while enemy fighters hesitated to expose themselves to attack from the seemingly indestructible fighter above. The extraction helicopters appeared as dots on the horizon, two MH-60 Black Hawks flying nap of the earth to avoid the remaining surface-to-air threats. Their crews had been monitoring Phoenix's radio transmissions throughout the engagement, listening to a single pilot accomplish what an entire strike package had been unable to achieve. The lead pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Maria Angel Santos, had 15 years of combat experience and had never heard anything like the sustained close air support mission Phoenix was providing. Phoenix 77, this is Angel Flight. We have visual on your position and the extraction site. You're trailing significant amounts of fluid and your aircraft appears to be on fire. Zara glanced at her engine temperature gauge, which had climbed well beyond maximum operating limits and was approaching the point where catastrophic failure became inevitable. Orange flames were indeed visible in her mirrors, licking along the engine cowling where damaged fuel lines fed the conflagration. The F-35's fire suppression systems had either failed or been depleted, leaving her to manage the emergency through flight technique alone. Angel Flight Phoenix 77. The bird's got some issues, but she's still flying. Proceed with extraction. I'll maintain overwatch. The helicopter insertion played out like a precisely choreographed ballet, with Angel Flight's two aircraft descending into the valley under cover of Phoenix's protective presence. The surviving enemy fighters made several attempts to engage the helicopters with small arms fire, but each time Zara's cannon silenced their positions with surgical precision. Her aircraft had become an extension of her will, responding to control inputs despite massive system failures that should have made flight impossible. Spider and his team moved with professional efficiency, carrying their wounded toward the waiting helicopters while maintaining defensive positions around the landing zone. The sight of their extraction aircraft brought visible relief to faces that had accepted the possibility of dying in this unnamed valley. As each SEAL was loaded aboard, Zara felt a corresponding lightness, not from her aircraft's decreasing weight, but from the knowledge that 12 lives would see another sunrise. Angel Flight Trident team is secure and aboard. Phoenix 77, we owe you everything. The helicopters lifted off in a storm of rotor wash and dust, climbing rapidly toward safety, while Phoenix's failing F-35 continued its protective orbit. Only when the extraction aircraft had cleared the valley and reached friendly airspace did Zara finally turn her aircraft toward home. The engine temperature gauge had moved beyond red into unmarked territory, the needles quivering against their stops as internal temperatures climbed toward metallurgical failure. Kandahar Air Base appeared on her navigation display, still 67 miles away across mountainous terrain that offered few options for emergency landing. At her current rate of fuel consumption, she might reach the airfield with minutes of flying time remaining, assuming her engine didn't seize first. But the mathematical certainty of mechanical failure mattered less than the knowledge that 12 Navy SEALs were flying toward safety because she'd refused to abandon them. Kandahar Tower, Phoenix 77 declaring emergency. Battle-damaged F-35 inbound with engine fire and multiple system failures. Request priority handling and emergency equipment standing by. The tower's response carried professional calm despite the obvious concern. Phoenix 77, Kandahar Tower. You're cleared direct vectors as requested. Emergency equipment is positioning. Can you maintain level flight? The honest answer remained no, but Zara coaxed another few thousand feet of altitude from her dying aircraft, trading height for distance in the classical equations of emergency flight. Below, the Afghan landscape scrolled past in brown and tan monotony, broken by occasional villages that represented potential emergency landing sites if ejection became necessary. But ejection meant losing her aircraft, and something deeper than military pride rebelled against that prospect. The F-35 had carried her through impossible odds, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft while maintaining enough functionality to complete the mission. The Phoenix emblem beneath her canopy had proven prophetic. Both pilot and aircraft had risen from what should have been a fatal engagement to achieve something approaching miraculous. Abandoning such a faithful machine to gravity and fire felt like betrayal. 20 miles from Kandahar, the engine finally began its death throes. Internal components, heated beyond their design limits, started expanding and seizing with mechanical grinding sounds that vibrated through the airframe. Compressor stall warnings illuminated as the turbine blades contacted their housings, destroying the delicate balance of pressures and temperatures that enabled flight. Within seconds, 38,000 pounds of thrust became 38,000 pounds of dead weight. Mayday, Mayday, Phoenix 77. Complete engine failure, attempting dead-stick landing at Kandahar. The silence that followed engine shutdown was profound and terrifying. Without the constant whine of the turbine, Zara could hear wind flowing over control surfaces, the creak of cooling metal, and her own steady breathing in the oxygen mask. The F-35 became a $35 million glider, its sophisticated systems powered only by emergency battery backups with limited operational time. Kandahar's runway appeared ahead, a ribbon of concrete shimmering in the desert heat haze. From 15,000 feet and 23 miles distance, the approach looked manageable, until she calculated the glide ratio and realized she would arrive several thousand feet too high and traveling too fast for a survivable landing. Dead-stick approaches required precise energy management, trading altitude for distance while maintaining enough airspeed to retain control authority. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, their flashing lights visible even from her current altitude. Fire trucks, Ambulances and crash recovery equipment stood ready to respond to whatever remained after impact. Master Sergeant Patterson would be among the crews, she knew, waiting to see if his favorite pilot would walk away from another impossible situation. The final approach required every skill acquired through 13 years of military flying. Without engine power, she had one chance to get the energy management right: too high, and she'd overshoot the runway into the desert beyond; too low, and she'd impact short of the pavement with catastrophic results. The F-35's flight control computers, running on battery power, provided what assistance they could, but ultimately the landing depended on pilot technique refined through thousands of hours of experience. At 2,000 feet above ground level, Zara deployed the aircraft's speed brakes and landing gear, accepting the increased drag in exchange for steeper descent angles. The runway grew larger in her windscreen, concrete details becoming visible as she descended through 1,000 feet at nearly twice normal approach speed. Landing gear warnings illuminated. The nose strut had only partially extended, damaged by ground fire during one of her attack runs. The touchdown was violent but survivable, the F-35's main gear absorbing the impact as she fought to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the runway centerline. Without nose gear support, the aircraft's front end dropped onto the concrete in a shower of sparks and grinding metal. The titanium structure held together as designed, but the deceleration forces pressed her forward against the restraint harness with crushing intensity. 3,000 feet of runway disappeared beneath her aircraft as speed gradually decreased from dangerous to merely uncomfortable. When forward motion finally ceased, she was still 200 feet from the overrun area, surrounded by emergency vehicles converging on her position. The acrid smell of overheated brakes and burning hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit, but the F-35 structure remained intact around her. Phoenix 77, Kandahar Tower, are you able to egress the aircraft? Zara's hands moved through the emergency shutdown checklist with practiced efficiency, securing systems and safing ejection seat components before attempting to exit the aircraft. Her legs felt unsteady when she finally stood on solid ground, the accumulated stress of combat and emergency landing creating a temporary disconnect between mind and body. Around her, fire crews sprayed foam on hot metal, while medical personnel waited to assess her condition. Master Sergeant Patterson appeared at her elbow, his weathered face creased with concern and something approaching awe. He'd seen combat aircraft return from missions before, but nothing quite like the battle-damaged F-35 cooling on the runway behind them. Bullet holes and shrapnel impacts covered nearly every square foot of external surface, while the engine compartment showed evidence of the internal fire that had finally claimed her power plant. "Ma'am, how in hell did you keep this thing in the air?" His voice carried genuine amazement as he surveyed the damage. "Half the flight control surfaces are shot to pieces, you've got holes in both fuel tanks, and the engine looks like it went through a blender." "She wanted to come home, wrench," Zara replied, pulling off her helmet to reveal sweat-soaked hair and the pale complexion of someone who'd spent the last hour calculating probabilities of survival. "Sometimes that's enough." The debriefing would come later, along with the after-action reports and damage assessments that followed every combat mission. Intelligence officers would want detailed accounts of enemy positions and defensive capabilities. Maintenance personnel would catalog every system failure and structural damage point. Medical staff would conduct mandatory post-combat psychological evaluations designed to identify pilots struggling with the accumulated stress of warfare. But none of that mattered in the immediate aftermath, as word of Phoenix's mission spread through the base with the velocity that only military gossip could achieve. 12 Navy SEALs were alive because one pilot had refused to accept the mathematical impossibility of success. An F-35 that should have been destroyed 3 times over had completed its mission and returned home through pilot skill and mechanical resilience that defied engineering predictions. Colonel Rodriguez found her in the squadron ready room 2 hours later, his earlier skepticism replaced by something resembling humility. The preliminary damage assessment lay open on the table between them. 7 pages of technical analysis, documenting impacts, failures, and system degradation that painted a picture of systematic destruction, overcome through pure determination. "Phoenix, I owe you an apology," he began, his voice carrying the weight of a career spent making judgments about pilot capabilities. "I've been flying for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today. The board is recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross." Zara looked up from the technical reports, her dark eyes reflecting fatigue that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "Sir, I just did my job. Those SEALs would have done the same for any of us." "No, they wouldn't have," Rodriguez replied firmly. "Because none of us would have attempted what you did today. We would have declared the mission impossible and let 12 good men die rather than risk a $35 million aircraft. You proved that sometimes the impossible is just another word for difficult." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the ready room door. Spider Morrison entered, still wearing the dusty fatigues from his extraction, his left arm in a sling from shrapnel wounds sustained during the firefight. Behind him came the other 11 members of Trident Team, their faces carrying the particular solemnity of men who'd looked death in the eye and lived to talk about it. "Ma'am, we wanted to thank you personally," Spider said, his voice rough with emotion that Navy SEALs weren't supposed to display. "What you did up there, we've never seen anything like it. You flew through fire to get to us, and you stayed when any sane pilot would have gone home." The formal presentation that followed felt surreal to Zara, 12 of America's most elite warriors standing at attention while expressing gratitude for her intervention. Each man stepped forward to shake her hand and offer personal thanks, their words carrying the weight of lives preserved through her actions. For operators accustomed to being the ones providing salvation to others, accepting rescue required a humility that didn't come naturally. Commander Kelly was the last to speak, his weathered face reflecting 3 decades of special operations experience. "Phoenix, in 30 years of doing this job, I've worked with a lot of pilots, transport crews who flew us into bad situations, attack pilots who provided fire support when things went sideways, and helicopter crews who pulled us out when everything went to hell. But I've never seen anyone do what you did today." He paused, searching for words adequate to express the magnitude of her achievement. "You didn't just save 12 lives. You restored our faith in what's possible when someone refuses to accept defeat. That F-35 should have been shot down 6 times over, and you should have ejected rather than risk your life for hours. Instead, you proved that sometimes the only thing standing between victory and defeat is one person willing to keep fighting when everyone else has given up." The medal ceremony 3 weeks later brought together personnel from across the theater of operations. The Distinguished Flying Cross had been awarded only 17 times since the beginning of operations in Afghanistan, making Zara's recognition significant not just for her squadron but for the entire Air Force. General Patricia Hammer Williams, commander of Air Force's Central Command, flew in personally to conduct the presentation. Lieutenant Colonel Nakamura, the general's voice carried across the assembled crowd, "Your actions on the morning of April 15th represent the finest traditions of American military aviation. Flying through intense anti-aircraft fire to provide close air support for embattled ground forces, you demonstrated courage, skill, and dedication that resulted in the successful extraction of 12 special operations personnel who would otherwise have been killed or captured." The medal's weight seemed disproportionate to its size as it settled against Zara's chest, the ribbons joining the collection that chronicled 13 years of military service. Around her, the assembled personnel stood at attention, their faces reflecting a new understanding of what they'd witnessed. Phoenix was no longer the small woman whose capabilities they'd questioned. She'd become something approaching legend. But legends, Zara knew, were built on the bones of those who'd attempted similar feats and failed. For every story of miraculous survival and impossible success, 10 others ended in memorial services and folded flags. Her achievement represented not just personal skill, but the accumulated luck and circumstance that allowed anyone to survive long enough to become exceptional. The reception that followed brought congratulations from pilots who'd previously dismissed her abilities, mechanics who'd worked on her aircraft, and intelligence officers who'd briefed her missions. Master Sergeant Patterson presented her with a photograph of her battle-damaged F-35, taken during the post-flight inspection, signed by every member of the maintenance crew who'd kept her aircraft mission-ready. "Ma'am, we wanted you to have this," he said, his voice carrying paternal pride. "It's not every day we get to work on a bird that comes home looking like she fought the devil himself and lived to tell about it. The new F-35 they're assigning you is nice and all, but she'll have big shoes to fill." The photograph showed her aircraft from multiple angles, documenting the extent of battle damage that had somehow failed to prevent her return. Bullet holes, shrapnel impacts, and burn damage covered nearly every external surface, while the engine compartment resembled the aftermath of an explosion. That such a devastated machine had continued flying defied both engineering analysis and mathematical probability. Spider Morrison approached during the reception's final hour, his arm still in a sling, but his demeanor much improved from their first post-mission meeting. The other members of Trident team had already rotated back to the United States for medical treatment and debriefing, but Spider had remained in theater to complete their interrupted mission against the Taliban commander who'd caused their initial difficulties. "Phoenix, I wanted you to know, we got him," Spider said quietly, referring to the high-value target whose elimination had brought them to that valley initially. "Intel located him in a compound 12 clicks north of where you found us. Different approach, better planning, and your air support kept us covered throughout the operation." The successful completion of their mission provided a satisfying conclusion to events that had begun with near disaster. 12 lives saved, one high-value target eliminated, and proof that impossible odds could sometimes be overcome through exceptional individual performance and unwavering determination to succeed regardless of cost. But the true measure of Phoenix's achievement became apparent in the weeks and months that followed, as her story spread through military communities worldwide. Young pilots requested transfers to her squadron, hoping to learn from someone who demonstrated that theoretical limitations could be overcome through skill, courage, and refusal to accept defeat. Maintenance crews took pride in working on aircraft flown by someone who'd proven their mechanical reliability under the worst possible conditions. The tactical lessons from her mission were incorporated into training curricula at every level of military aviation education. Case studies examined her decision-making process, flight techniques, and target engagement methods, seeking to understand how one pilot had accomplished what entire strike packages had been unable to achieve. But the human element, the intangible quality that enabled someone to continue fighting when logic demanded retreat, remained impossible to quantify or teach. 6 months after the mission, Zara received orders transferring her to the United States Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base. Her combination of operational experience and demonstrated ability to extract maximum performance from aircraft under extreme conditions made her an ideal candidate for the nation's most demanding flying assignment. Test pilots flew prototype aircraft to their absolute limits, gathering data that would determine the capabilities and limitations of future weapon systems. The farewell dinner held by her squadron carried emotional weight that surprised everyone involved. Fighter pilots traditionally maintained professional distance from their colleagues, understanding that combat operations created casualty rates that made close personal relationships psychologically unsustainable. But Phoenix had transcended normal squadron dynamics through achievements that bordered on mythical.